There is a cliche saying, I guess a fairly well-known saying that some of you may have heard before, but I'm going to share it. It says, if you don't think that small things can make a big difference, try sleeping in a room with a mosquito. Have you heard that before? No? Maybe it's a southern thing. Since we are in spider season here where we live, I think the same could be said for sleeping in a room where you know there is a big spider. That if you don't think something small can make a big disruption, then my kids, so, we're in the parsonage just over yonder, and last week, both kids kept coming upstairs to use the upstairs bathrooms, coming upstairs to shower and all of that. And after a couple days, I'm like, what are y'all doing? You have your bathroom down there. And they both are like, spider. And it wasn't even a big one. But they were just like, nope, just this little spider caused a big disruption in their lives. And they would not use that room until that spider was relocated. This kind of thing, whether we're talking about spiders or mosquitoes, small things that make a big difference can cause a big disruption. Could be a parable, or it could be a wisdom saying from either Jesus or James. As we talked about last week, the book of James. Did anyone, by the way, go back and read James? Yeah, it's not very long. It's an interesting book because it's grouped in there with the letters. It's grouped in there with the epistles, but it's not really a letter. It starts off like one, but then it's more like Proverbs. It's really wisdom sayings. As we said last week, it's kind of harsh at times. It's kind of strict. There seems to be some finger wagging. I think James was just very direct, and it comes across as kind of sometimes confrontational, but it's worth spending time with. In it, James is putting out some wisdom into the world, and specifically to communities of faith. James is saying, here is how to be a community of faith. Here's what's important. Here are the pitfalls. Here are the problems. And some of what he has to say is remarkably relevant, like we talked about last week and this week too. So when I was looking at planning worship, I chose that for this 3-week stretch, we'd be spending time with James. Chose it several months ago. And like God often does, the timing was just impeccable. Because today, this passage, which I initially thought when I looked at it several months ago, I was like, this passage is really about small things that are big. Small things that can have great power. And, maybe to explore this idea, we would look at the natural world and look at seeds and things like that. And so some of the hymns we're singing kind of have that sense, right? And then I spent more time with the passage this past week. And it is about small things being powerful, but in particular, it is talking about speech. It is talking about the words that we say. And this is a part of James's larger teaching. Basically, the whole book of James has 3 main points, and one we talked about last week, which is that in order to have what he called, and this is his language, not mine, to have true religion. And this is what he meant, like he thought to be a real follower of Jesus, there's 3 things. One is to care for the vulnerable in action and not just in words. To do what you can to help and protect the vulnerable, whether that's children or widows or whomever. The second one is to keep oneself, and he used this language, unstained by the world. And we'll talk about that next week a little bit. And the third one is what we're on today, and that is his teaching about being a real follower of Jesus has to do with being very careful about what you say and how you say it. So for James, speech was as much a Christian practice as giving and service and prayer. So I suspect all of us have a prayer practice. And I would think if we were put to the question, we'd probably say, yeah, prayer is one of the benchmark, one of the core practices of being a Christian, as is service, of caring for people, doing whatever we can to help folks, and giving, whether it's tithing through the church or giving in some other capacity. We would probably all list these as core Christian practices, things that go way back, as long as there have been followers of Jesus and people gathering to worship and learn and all of that. These have been core. Prayer, giving, service. And James, though, would add to that list, and he would say speech. What you say is a core Christian practice. And he has this particular focus on the harm that can be done by words and speeches by people in power. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought too. It was like this little 3-verse thing that just happened to be on our calendar hits this week. Can anyone think of an example of a person in power who used words to incite something that was dangerous or possibly deadly? I know it's a big ask. I know it's going to be hard to think of such a thing. Maybe something about immigrants eating pets in Ohio. Which has been, I will say, one of the funnier things, because God bless, even though their lives have been very disrupted in Springfield, Ohio, there have been some just wonderful responses to the absurdity that there's immigrants who are eating people's cats and dogs. That the pet store in Springfield, Ohio, put in the front window, all-you-can-eat buffet on, which I thought was just an incredible response to the absurdity of that. There's been some, but it highlights just how problematic it is when people who have a platform, who have power, can just say whatever they want. In terms of Springfield and all of this, it's problematic, but it hasn't turned completely violent or deadly yet. But we know of people who are in power who speak words that incite riots, in which people do die and are injured and traumatized. So James's wisdom today seems particularly and sadly apropos. The more power, the more status you have, the more you have to speak carefully. If you have a platform, if you have power, you can't just say all sorts of stuff. It has the potential to burn things down, to destroy. But this text isn't really directed at politicians, even though it seems to fit quite nicely. It's actually directed at us. It's directed at Christians and churches. And he's talking about people within congregations who have a little status or have some power, which frankly, when you're in smaller congregations, is all of us. It's everybody. And notice that James doesn't really discriminate between or about the location of our speech. Is he talking about how we talk to each other inside the church, from church member to church member, and what we say and how we say it? Or is he talking about what we say and the voice we have out in our community? Is he talking about that kind of speech? He doesn't clarify, so I think maybe both. In his usual direct way that I've come to appreciate, despite the harshness, James is saying that our speech must be loving. Our speech must be kind. Our speech must be constructive. It must be just. And that commandment to do that, to speak in this way, is building on what we talked about last week, which is the imperative to be doers and not just hearers of the word. And all of this, those two things put together, to be doers, to care, not just say, oh, I hope that poor child is safe, but to work for their safety, or to say, oh, that poor older person, they're hungry. Oh, I wish they were full. I pray for them in their hunger. It's like, no, James is like, no, you got to do it. between that and what he's talking about today, about saying that what we say is critically important, hugely important, it's really about integrity. And this is the larger theme of what James is writing about. It's about us having integrity. And I've used that word before, and I want to define it, because sometimes we think when somebody says integrity, or when I say it in this context, we're talking about making the right decision, right? Like, oh, that person has integrity. We would think like, oh, well, that means that they're making good choices. But integrity actually means that what we say we believe matches what we do and choose. And this is what James is really arguing about, or not arguing, but like hammering on about, is that people of faith, followers of Jesus, must have integrity. Must have integrity. So, what would you guess is the number one reason, or at least one of the main reasons, that people who steer clear of churches give? They're hypocrites. That's right. That we say one thing, that we claim one set of values, and that we do something else. They look at church folks and they think that we lack integrity. And in all fairness, there may be more truth to that than we are sometimes comfortable with. That for many years we have gotten to where we prioritize certain things and deprioritize other things. But I think that this congregation in Bellevue First, I actually think we're on a path to write a new story about that. So that when people look at who we are and what we do and what we choose, they would say, those folks are walking the talk. And that brings me great joy and great hope. But it does raise an important point, and I think this is part of what James is trying to get at too, is that if grace does not show up in the flesh of a congregation, and by flesh I mean if grace doesn't show up in our hands, in our actions, in our presence, in our words, then where will people readily find it? I remember going back to church. I was raised in the church, and then for much of my teenage years and young adult years, I was outside the church, left the church. And I went back in my mid to late 20s. And I distinctly remember going back to church. And I remember that first Sunday vividly. And what I remember about it was how vulnerable I felt. Because I was in a place where I was seeking, and I was hopeful, and I was open-hearted and open-minded. And I went to this place where I went by myself, where it was just strangers. And I went looking for God and looking for something holy, something sacred. And, dumb luck and divine providence, I think, are kind of the same thing. I just happened to choose a church where I found some of that, where there was great diversity and people loved on one another. And it was very human, and yet there was a spirit of love there. And blessedly, my vulnerability and my seeking wasn't, I don't even know what word to use here, wasn't disappointed. So we think about that as we encounter people both who are here and the people we encounter out in the world. People are seeking. They're looking for God. They're looking for hope. They're looking for joy. They're looking for a safe, loving, blessed community. Because it's a hard world, and we look for that stuff. We need it. We're humans. That's a place of vulnerability, right? They're just full of hope. Whether we're in here or out there, if they don't experience us as grace-filled and loving, where our actions and our words and our presence doesn't feel Christ-like, where else are they going to find it? This is why I think that James really focuses on small things. He talks about rudders steering big ships, right? And is anyone, I mean, this is kind of some of you are sailors. I'm amazed when they pull even big ships out. Often the rudders are quite small. And yet they can turn a big ship. Or things like sparks. I mean, we live in wildfire country. It doesn't take much. You hear of, stories of just a little ember. Something happens when somebody's towing an RV or is at a campfire, and all of a sudden, 20,000 acres later. We know that small things can have great power, and this is what James is really talking about here when he's talking about the people of faith and what we say and what we do. Is James understood that in God's economy, and that's what biblical scholars call it, that small does not mean powerless. And in fact, it's through small things that God chooses to come into the world and change it. That's why so much of God's work is done with babies and seeds and small things, grain. And we know that small words spoken in anger can break, can damage and hurt. But we also know, and we're reminded, that small words spoken in love can repair and heal and create a new future for people. Small actions done in anger or hate or intolerance can destroy communities, can destroy lives, but small actions done in great love and selflessness can change lives, can rescue lives. Small moments that pass in the blink of an eye have the potential to destroy and hurt and break down, but they can also build up. And this is all very good news. James is saying in James's peculiar way that we are not powerless, that we have power. He's trying to remind the congregations back then and the churchgoers, and they weren't megachurches back then, just like they're not megachurches here. He is saying that though these congregations be small and though each member is exactly like we are, very ordinary, not a big player in the big picture of all things, that we have power, we have potential to change the world. Not that we can draft policy that changes an entire nation, but we can bless lives. We can chart new paths. We can offer hope. And we don't know, we have no idea what that will do. All with a word, all with a gesture, all with a moment. If a few words can incite riots, cannot a few words also build peace? Grace given body, grace given hands, grace given voice, grace given presence for a world, for a community, for a person, for each of us, so much in need. May it be so, and amen. So as let's make sure I know where we're at and what's going on. Yeah. As we get closer to our time of prayer, we're going to sing hymn 2193. You can remain seated. It's called Lord, Listen to Your Children Praying. I believe it's out of the Taizé tradition, which is a French contemplative tradition. Let's sing this one a few times through. What do you think? You'll watch me. Okay. So like 3-ish, 3 or 4, something like that.